speak today on Podcast for Inquiry with Paco Calvo. Paco is a professor of philosophy of science and the principal investigator of the Minimal Intelligence Laboratory at the University of Murcia, Spain. His research is on the philosophy of plant neurobiology, ecological psychology, and embodied cognitive science. He is the author of Planta Sapiens, which is the topic of our episode today. Paco's thesis was novel to me, that plants are, in a meaningful sense, intelligent. We start by discussing what intelligence is and how we might recognize it in other beings. We have gone from thinking that only humans are intelligent to including other mammals, and now most people grant that most animals, including birds and octopi, exhibit intelligent behaviors. Paco extends this to plants by detailing what science has to say, both theoretically and empirically, about the hypothesis of plant intelligence. We conclude our conversation with some thoughts about the moral and philosophical implications if plants truly are intelligent. It's with great pleasure that I bring you my conversation with Paco Calvo. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Paco Calvo, thank you for taking the time and speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to talk to you about your provocative book, Planta Sapiens. And I say provocative not because it's necessarily controversial, but because your core thesis that plants are in a very meaningful way intelligent is not an idea that I had entertained before. And so it's provocative in that it challenged some of the assumptions that I've carried throughout my entire life. So
that's good. That's good to know. That was the idea.
Yeah, and I've read your book and I quite enjoyed it. And I want to get into a lot of it. I want to get into depth into your arguments for that thesis. But why don't we start by just at a very high level? The subtitle of your book is "The New Science of Plant Intelligence." So I want to start with basically two questions. Why do you think that the word intelligence would apply to plants at all? I would say that is not a widely held perspective. And secondly, your subtitle says the new science. What have we learned recently in the last decade or two, say, that makes you that changed your mind? I mean, given that it's the new science, perhaps we didn't know enough for you to think that way 20 years ago. So what have we learned that changed your mind and that prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, no, thanks. Great questions. I mean, starting for the very last, I would say I understand that as a subtitle, the new science sounds really good, right? And it's catchy. But I would actually say the good old science, right? Mm-hmm. What do I mean by this? That if you think about it, we are not doing anything different from what animal scientists try to do when they are aiming to uncover animal intelligence. So which is the science that we use to understand the intelligence of an organism, right? Well, we can observe their behavior. So if you are, you are tracking an animal's behavior, you want to see what this animal is up to, well, you can observe their behavior. You can try to understand their inner doings by tracking neural correlates. So some, electrical signals or neural correlates of their doings. So those two windows to peek into what the animal is doing are the very same windows we use to peek into what a plant is doing, right? So the new science doesn't have to do with the methodologies themselves, with the toolkit. It's the very same toolkit. It has to do with how we need to change our frame of mind to apply it to plants. Plants are simply, slower. the time scale in which they behave is different from the animal time scale, certainly. But that doesn't mean that the same protocols, the same experimental designs cannot be applied. We just need to customize them for plants, right? So the new science have to do with rethinking our approach to the good old way to doing science, which is let's observe their behavior. If their behavior is sophisticated enough, if it's complex enough, if it's flexible enough, then we are talking about, hey, this pattern of behavior deserves to be called intelligent, right?
Mhm.
And yeah, sorry, yeah.
Well, so I that comes down to, I guess, really a core question, which
Hmm.
is how do we detect
Hmm.
intelligence? How do
Yeah.
we define intelligence? Let me put a little context behind that. If
Hmm.
we go back about 200 years, give or take, uh, the the overwhelming the dominant perspective is that only humans, only people were intelligent.
Yeah.
Only people, only humans, fellow humans, had feelings.
Hmm.
Only humans felt pain.
Hmm.
So there were, live demonstrations of vivisections
Absolutely.
of dogs,
Yeah.
and they would like staple them to a table in front of a hall, and they would squeal and they would yelp. And today, I mean, even just describing it, my compassion goes
Isn't it
to these
amazing?
animals.
Amazing.
But the perspective at the time was, this is just a conditioned response.
Yeah.
They are animals. They have no feelings. This is just natural selection, which causes them
Yeah.
to yelp and to cry and so on. And that it's not real. They're not people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
and so they do that. Now, when it comes to certain pets, animals that we're close to, like that perspective. I mean, now you abuse a dog, you're arrested. It's against the law. You could
Yeah.
get fined. You can go to jail. Um, so how do we recognize intelligence in a meaningful way that doesn't that recognizes actual intelligence,
Hmm.
whether it's in an animal or in what you're saying is a plant, that doesn't get fooled
Hmm.
by something that
Yeah.
might not be intelligent.
Definitely. Well, you see, this gives me some hope that we are on the right path, because if you think about it, these 200, 300 years have passed, and we've been able to change our minds. So
Mhm.
that's the good news. I mean, I would like to think that the bottle is half full, not half empty, because if you think about it, what is changing is education, scientific education. So nowadays, you see, actually, we are considering the sapiens, or the of your pet right now. Oh my
Yes,
God! Yeah,
we have cats.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, I can tell you, I mean, those guys are sentient. We know they are smart. I mean, we definitely know that, right? There is no question about it. So you think, how were we able not to see it 300 years ago? Isn't it amazing? So to me, if I mean, from the book from Planet Sapiens, this little spoiler at the very end in the epilogue, I speak of the educational system, right? I talk about I call it the hippocampus fattening farm, like something like think, hey, we don't quite get it. We think education is about storing knowledge, memories that you then regurgitate, as if we didn't have to do any thinking in between, just memorize and regurgitate. Um, Education is key to think outside the box. And this requires that we consider seriously, how could we think that other organisms wouldn't be sentient? I mean, sentience comes with life itself. To be alive is to have a mind, right? So the question is, how can we not fool ourselves into thinking that these guys pass the test when they shouldn't pass the test, right? It could be zombies. How do we know they are not zombies? Well, again, go back to the good old methodologies applied to plants. We don't need to do anything different from what we have done thus far. If you think nowadays, we start to think, okay, maybe not just primates, maybe not just mammals, maybe you don't need to have a neocortex. Birds, we know, look at birds, all the stuff they do. And then we say, hey, yeah, sure, they can join us and join the club, the cognitive club, or the sentience club. We know birds are smart creatures, right?
Right. So it's not just people. It's not just
Sure,
humans.
sure,
It's
sure.
not just mammals. It extends
So
further.
That's it. And this is key. We've been extending it further gradually. So from birds, we've gone to invertebrates. Now there is a lot of research in invertebrate animals like insects, like honeybees, ants, termites, cephalopods, octopus, right? Octopuses. And we say, hey, I mean, these guys certainly do their things in a complete different way. But what they do still is sophisticated, still is flexible, still is anticipatory. So to me, intelligence, when I speak of Planta sapiens, right, I mean I mean it literally. So people say, "Oh, you mean it metaphorically? The title of the book is some kind of metaphor. You're playing." No, no. Homo sapiens, Planta sapiens, we are all on the same page. And the page we are all in has to do with behavior, not just being adaptive. Because if you think it's just an adaptation, you are right. We might go back to these guys doing vivisections. So, oh, you see, that's just an adaptation, but they are not really doing anything special in their heads. It's just like this condition hardwired responses, you said, right? Well, how do you know that plants' responses are not hardwired, pre-programmed routines without the need of any sentience on their behalf?
Hmm.
The way to answer that question is to apply literally the same recipe we've used to cook up an answer to invertebrates, to honeybees, to ants, to termites, to birds, which is not to use humans as the gold standard. So they don't need to resemble us to be sentient. That's the problem, that we think they need to resemble us somehow.
Right. So we have to come up with a definition of intelligence
Mm.
that isn't they do the same thing we do in the same way that we do. All right.
Otherwise,
Let me bring up an example from your book.
right.
So you said you talk about the flowers of orchids. I'm just going to quote you for a
Mm,
moment here.
mm.
The flowers of orchids, with their astonishing array of different colors and spears, are exquisitely formed to deceive insects and load them with pollen, and yet are examples of natural selection and not cognition.
That's
So
it.
the complexity, I mean, in a sense, we can think of them as devious,
Mm.
as and you could say it's intelligent because they are fooling intelligent insects,
Right.
and manipulating them to their own ends. And yet, that is an example of natural selection. But when you talked elsewhere in the book about climbing beans, how they explore their environment and they
Mm,
climb
mm.
walls and how they grow, you say that's an example of plant intelligence. So my question for you is, what's the difference here?
Mm, mm.
Why is climbing beans an example of intelligence, and why can't that also be explained
Yeah.
as mere reflex responses? Why is there more to it? Why is it intelligence? Why is the design of their, or sorry,
Right.
why is the appearance of their that is very effective natural
Yeah.
selection, and climbing and beans climbing a wall to grow an example of intelligence, because that
Right.
wasn't entirely clear to me.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, it's a great point because I mean, this is not a sharp divide. This is some gray. This is not black or white. So this is
Hmm.
like a continuum, right? So certainly, any behavior has got to be adaptive. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. I mean, the behavior of any organism on Earth that hasn't gone extinct is adaptive. They would have gone extinct if it wasn't adaptive, right? So adaptive behavior is certainly needed, but it's not enough. It's not sufficient because
Hmm.
what we care about when you are talking to the cat you have right now in your lap, you might be thinking, hey, on top of certainly all the selective processes that have gone, in this case, well, through domestication, but applied to natural selection, right? The same goes for wild or domesticated organisms. But on top of whatever they have inherited, what comes in their genes, what might be pre programmed, right, through natural selection, you need to pay attention to the actual doings, the history of training, of learning, what this guy, this individual, this particular organism has acquired, has learned through its own exposition, through its own interaction with the surroundings. So there is something that your cat knows that relates to your t-shirt, to your fridge, to all the settings in your room. That is not in their genes. It has to do with their experience, their personal experience, right? So when you look at your personal experience, we are trying to track, to find out, to unearth, in our case, through time-lapse photography. That's what we do, time-lapse photography. We try to find behavioral patterns that, on top of being adaptive, are flexible enough when animal or an organism in general needs to change gear to say, hey, now I was used to doing this, but it's not pre-programmed. I can change gear and do something else instead. Because things could go wrong. There are so many different contingencies, and you need to be ready to change gear. And not just ready to change gear in a flexible manner, but do it anticipatorily. So one key issue here to understand intelligent behavior is that uh, you cannot simply be reacting to the environment. You need to be behaving proactively. And proactive behavior requires that you are somehow connecting the dots, that you are able to say, hey, when this thing happens, oh, I pick the regularity. If I pick a regularity out there, I'm able to anticipate, to behave proactively, right? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So here, and in a goal directed manner, so in a target directed manner. So I'm not simply growing. Take the climbing beam you mentioned. You are not simply growing and growing and growing. That's an adaptive behavior. Vines grow, certainly. But if you are growing and you are exploring your surroundings, like a target, a pole that you could twine around, you might change course of action, pattern of growth, depending on the local conditions, on whatever is going on right now, right here, right? So we are talking about learning, decision making, memorizing. If you think about it, we are using psychological predicates to learn, to memorize, to make decisions, to see. These type of predicates, psychological predicates, are the ones that you cannot study if you are doing plant physiology, period. So if I am just doing plant physiology, period, I would understand, what photosynthesis is about, or respiration, or stomata opening and closing, right? The tiny pores in the underleaf
Mhm.
of the leaves. But I wouldn't be tracking those behaviors that are potentially smart behaviors. They might not be smart, potentially smart. So to me, that's critical because if you think about it, unless we change our mind, and that's the main thesis of the book, unless we change the way we look at plants, we will never find out those behaviors. We will simply appreciate, oh, look at the plant, it's growing towards the light. That's just a reactive response unless there is something else to it. It's got to be a bite, a twist.
So, all right. So, how do you protect? So, this is uh, there's a danger here,
Yeah,
Paco, and I want to avoid both dangers, right? And one is what you're saying is that unless we change our mind, there's something really happening here, and we're going to miss it because
absolutely.
we're making an assumption, and so
Mm.
we're not even looking for the evidence that they're behaving in an
Yeah,
anticipatory manner, and we just ignore it. So that's definitely a risk, and I want to avoid that. But I also want to avoid the potential that I want so much to believe that plants are intelligent that I'm going to cherry pick the evidence, or I'm going to make the argument that even that there's something there, but it's
yeah,
illusory,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? Because I hear that a lot. I mean, I hear this line of argument from people that are claiming that psychic powers exist, that we can
Right.
read minds and so on, and that we need to shift our view of the universe. And based on everything I've seen so far, I don't believe that we can that anybody can actually see the future
Yeah,
or
yeah,
can
yeah, yeah.
actually read minds. So how do we guard against?
Absolutely.
How do our? I mean, I guess Carl Sagan put it. We need to keep an open mind, right? We need so that we can see the things that are there, but not so open that our brains fall out, that we believe things that aren't there.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the case of plants, how, I mean, that's always an exquisite balance,
Mm,
right?
yeah,
So, in the case of plant intelligence, how do we keep our eyes open to see what is there, but not
without
detect
fooling ourselves.
patterns or ascribe
Yeah, yeah,
agency
yeah.
if it's not?
I got you, got you. No, no, that's look, Leslie, that's my headache number one.
Okay.
So in my lab, that's my headache number one. First, not to fall prey of those biases myself,
Hmm.
not to be extra careful. We all have to be extra careful in doing science. We've got to do good science, robust
Yes.
science, right?
Yeah.
So we need to gather as robust evidence as possible. And to do that, look at this. We only need to follow the ABC of the scientific method, which is first we need to replicate. So we need independent labs replicating results. I have a lot of negative results where I have tried to replicate other people's studies. And surprise, surprise, some of them were false positives. So there was nothing there, and the results had been overinterpreted. So I can hear you. I can hear
Hmm.
you. So we are on the same page, because that is my worry. If you recall, in the preface of the book, I say something along those lines. I say, hey, look, this book is both addressed to the plant physiologist with a reductionist or a mechanistic approach. Those who just say, hey, this is just nothing here going on beyond what physiology gives you. And on the other hand, this is also addressed to those people who might think, hey, we're going to start, like a new sect or something. Like, no, no, watch out. We have a problem with both ends of the spectrum. We need to find the middle ground. And the middle ground is simply not avoiding over-interpreting the results and under delivering. That's it. That's what you're saying. So we need to be avoiding confirmation biases. And to avoid the confirmation bias, we all know what the confirmation bias is. You end up seeing what you want to see. And we don't want to do that.
Right.
That's what I mean by the ABC of the scientific method. We need to be, look, I'm going to give you an example, a very clear example, because it's where I have just published a negative result. We are interested in replicating a study on associative learning in plants, right? So plants learning by association, like Pavlov's dog, right? Pavlov's dog, like the salivation and the bell, right?
Right. That's right. You ring a bell every time you feed them. Right.
And
Right. You feed them, ring a bell. Feed them, ring a bell. Feed them, ring a bell, and then you ring the bell, and they start salivating like they're about to be fed, even if there's no food.
that's it. That's it. So there's been experiments along those lines in plants, like trying to find out if plants are able to learn by association, right? We've replicated those experiments, and we didn't find any evidence. And we saw a lot of problems in these experiments. So what do I mean to say by this? First, well, this is very important. When I hear people, plant scientists, saying, I, I'm trying to demonstrate that plants are able to do this or that, I always say, why do you say that? Why do you say I'm trying to demonstrate that? Why don't you say I'm trying to find out if? I mean, I don't need to have a prejudice for or against. I need to bring the hypothesis, the empirical hypothesis, the testable hypothesis at the bench and test them, whatever the outcome might be. Come shine or rain. So it could be any outcome, and I don't need to have any preference for positive or negative evidence. A different issue. So one thing is that does this experimental design allow me to throw light upon this alleged competency? It might be something worth exploring, but the design itself might be flawed, which is what I have found many times. Flawed designs that were not able to throw any light because they were badly executed or lack of controls or all these things we were talking about
Right.
doing.
Just
Right?
like with every scientific experiment, it
That's it.
has to be done well, and there's
That's
only a few ways to do it well, and many, many ways to do it
that's what I
poorly.
mean. So just do the science and do it as well as you can.
Right.
Now a different issue, and this is to me what really interests me, is quite regardless of whether you have at the moment, right now, the evidence or not, that we lack a lot of evidence. A different issue is, do we have a theoretical framework worth exploring? So, if
Hmm.
as of today we have no evidence of associative learning in plants, to me the question is worth raising for the following reason. Imagine life on Earth. So, because we are far too used to thinking of what's inside the organism. So, we look inside our heads. Oh, what's inside my head? And so, we look inwards. Now, to me, the most important issue is to look outwards, to think, what is it that we all share? Organisms, animals, plants, fungi, cells, bacteria. So, what is it that we all share? All organisms in the tree of life. We share the planet we inhabit. full of regularities. Day-night cycles, temperature peaks and drops, relative humidity, nutrient patches, possibilities of it. So many things go like this. So the sun sets and the sun rises, all these things. So if all life on Earth evolved under conditions of regularities, can you tell me what's the reason to expect organisms not to tune to those regularities? It would be dumb. It would be stupid in evolutionary time. Who can afford not to pick those regularities when they are so informative? Oh, it's informative that the sun sets or that the sun
Mhm.
rises because temperature is going to drop, predators is going to come out to hand. So you need to know that, and you can pick those regularities. Do you see? This is the entry door to anticipatory behavior.
But
If you
it's actually it's regularities with variation, right? Like unless you're right on the equator, it's not the length of a day. I mean, it doesn't change a lot day to day, but over the course of a year, I'm here in Toronto,
completely
and it's in November, and I can tell you that the day is a lot shorter and the night is a lot longer today than it was in May.
Precisely. That is why we need to speak of the history of the individual and not
Mhm.
simply evolutionary time. That's what I meant about, what counts is that your cat is in your room with your fridge on your lap. So the context dependencies. So
Right. Okay.
that's precisely the point, that every individual will need to be monitoring the local environment to pick those regularities. What is informative to their doings, right? So who can afford not to pay attention to those regularities when they are meaningful and informative, right? And your life might depend on them, right? So connecting the dots is the name of the game. Many different organisms might have come up with different ways of connecting their own dots. But the fact that our dots to be connected somehow is what unites us all. That is the master key, right? That unlocks any branch in the tree of life, because we all rely on anticipatory behavior. You cannot wait for bad news to happen, because by the time you react it might be too late. So you need to react ahead of time. You need to respond proactively. And that is what I mean about the theoretical framework and the empirical hypothesis. So we have a theoretical framework which is, hey, plants being sessile doesn't mean they don't do things. They grow. We just need to slow down because, of course, their doings happens in a time scale so different from our scale of observation that unless we slow ourselves down or speed them up through time-lapse photography, we are going to miss their doings. So, of course, they are completely active and non-stopping doing things, monitoring, checking this, checking that. We just need to make an effort to put ourselves in their shoes. Then we will be able to observe their behavioral patterns. And then we will ask, hey, are their behaviors sufficiently flexible, sophisticated enough, anticipatory? Then we might say, check, check, check. Oh, that is the type of behavior that, had it been done, performed by an animal, we wouldn't have any issue, any concern in labeling it intelligent. But because it is a plant that has no neurons, we deny the possibility. So my question is, why? If that is a signature of intelligence, exhibiting that type of behavior, so be it. If that is a signature of intelligence, it should be a signature, a marker for any form of life whatsoever. But you cannot say, oh, I use this as a hint to intelligent behavior because you're an animal, but sorry, you cannot, despite exhibiting that type of behavior, because you are not an animal. So that's what I mean in the preface, remember, of the book, when I speak of this navel gazing attitude. So
Hmm.
we animals or human animals providing the gold standard. And you see, it's so funny because all these concerns we have with plants, all this skepticism, oh, plants cannot be intelligent, for God's sake, they cannot possibly be intelligent, they have no neurons, they don't walk around, they are sitting sessile, passive. We don't apply the same rule when we think of artificial intelligence, because we have created artificial intelligence to interact with us, and we provide the gold standard.
Well, yeah, I'm more skeptical personally about what we call artificial intelligence, but that's a separate conversation that I think we'll save for another time. I think that yeah, it might maybe one day, but I don't think we're there today. But you have, uh, I want to I want to come back to what you were saying just before that. When we look at octopuses, for
Right.
example, their brains are very different than our brains. But I think today, I mean, in a sense, they like each arm of an octopus has its own brain, which is a really bizarre way to think about it. But I think most people are willing to grant that an octopus is differently intelligent
Yeah.
than us today. You just laid out a whole set of criteria
Hmm.
that if any organism meets it, we should be able to deem it intelligent. So let's move on from speaking in principle to the results of your experiments, because we haven't so far talked really about
Hmm.
how plants
Yeah.
demonstrate their intelligence, and that this really is kind of the heart of your life's work
Right.
is the actual study of plants. So you've laid out the criteria um, for what is required to be considered intelligent in some meaningful way. Let's talk about how plants, in your view, meet
Hmm.
those criteria
Yeah.
and what convinced you that they are in fact intelligent. Because so far we haven't really talked about the
Right.
evidence
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
of
So
what of what plants actually do.
right, definitely. So one of the issues here, one of the critical issues, for example, is to know whether plants are able to integrate sensory information. So like truly integrate different channels of information and provide a response that is globally adaptive. So that this means not simply responding to light, like saying like a phototropic behavior. The sun is shining from this side, I grow towards the sunlight, right? Not just phototropic behavior or geotropic behavior or responding to some chemical or something, but that they are integrating all these informational channels, right? So when we time lapse climbing plants or vines in general, you can see that they are responding not just to the presence of the support or the pole, or if it's a host plant, think of a parasite, right? Some parasite plants are climbing onto host plants, right? Because they
Mm-hmm.
cannot do photosynthesis and they need to latch, like think of a daughter plant. So they need to find a host to twine around and suck their sugars, right? So when you see what these plants are doing, they are not simply resorting to information provided through light, like the light reflecting from the host, right? Bouncing from the source of the pole, the target, and then monitoring or sensing that light and growing in that direction. They are also picking chemicals. So the host, again, is secreting chemical signals, and you can tell whether that means food, rich food, or low, right? So less or more sugars. You can pick vibrational cues or mechanical cues, right? So the plant is not responding like an automaton, like those in those vivisection thought experiments, not thought experiments, for God's sake, I wish they had been thought experiments, right? But they are not responding to the mechanical stimulation or to the chemical or to the light. They are integrating it all, right? So when you are doing a time lapse experiment and you see that the plant, say you remove the pole, the control, you need the control, right? So I'm removing the pole, no target. So let's see how it grows. And it simply grows. You can track the trajectory and you can do a kinematical study, for example. You can study velocities, accelerations, so you can see how the plant is growing. When you stick a pole nearby, you can compare the pattern of growth when the pole is nearby to a plant growing in an empty space with no target around. So that gives you a good signature because you are looking at kinematical patterns or at dynamical patterns. So you are looking at the actual pattern of growth. If they are decelerating or accelerating, or say I'm growing, there is a target and I'm just growing, right? And I simply grow, constant velocity. I just grow, and then boom, oops, all of a sudden oh, lucky me, I found a pole, I'm gonna twine around it. That's very different from observing a pattern, a systematic pattern of acceleration and deceleration, where the plant, you can infer that the plant is trying to reach for the pole rather than simply bumping onto it by mere luck. See what I mean? So that
And
is
are plants actually demonstrating
right,
that
right.
interaction with the environment?
Right. Oh, definitely, definitely. So you have literature in which you are having kinematical studies, dynamical studies, studies where you are shifting the position of the pole to see if the plant tracks it, and so you see what I mean. So we can see how, again, whether their behavior is flexible enough in the face of uncertainty, of contingencies, of things that could be happening. And they are changing gear constantly because things happen in real time and they need to adapt quickly, flexibly, proactively. So we see that. Another example from below ground root growing. This is great. If you have some plants growing the roots into two different pots, right? One has more nutrient but constant, and the other one has less nutrient but on the rise, so it's increasing, such that in 2 3 days time it will overtake the other, right? So at present, if you are simply following what you need right now, you would grow your roots into the pot with more nutrients. But if you are thinking ahead of time, you pick the gradient and check that this one is high but constant, as opposed to this other one, which is less but on the rise. So that one will increase. And in 3 days' time, it will be advantageous to grow into this other pot, despite today having less amount of nutrients. So what you find is that plants grow their roots into the second pot, which means they are anticipating a better reward in a few days' time. So they are picking the gradient, not simply the amount, the absolute amount, right? So these examples are telling you that plants are not simply responding like an automaton to what's out there. They are in the process of meaning making. We speak of meaning making. They are meaning, so they are extracting meaning out of the interactions with their surroundings.
Right. Yeah, I think I was in a sense primed for your book by a couple other episodes, conversations that I had on Podcast for Inquiry back in January 2023. I spoke with Ashley Izak, and she's a plant scientist, but really her passion is gardening.
Right.
And one of the things that we talked about was, and something that has always amazed me, is that seeds, these like tiny little things that from which these sometimes very large plants sprout, they know which way is up. Like when you put a seed in the ground, or when it falls, its orientation can be anywhere, and it's and the seed isn't going to know how deep it is. Like there may not be any light because it's covered with soil, but it's able to detect which way is up. And we spoke about all of the different mechanisms
Hmm.
that this tiny seed uses to determine up from down, and how to orient itself so that it knows how to grow. And the other episode that I had was with the other conversation I had was with Kevin Mitchell. That was earlier this year, I think, back in March of 2024, and we were talking about free will.
Right.
And
Oh,
hit, which was yeah, it was a two-part episode. I had one scientist who said no, free will is a very compelling illusion, and then a second episode, the one with Kevin Mitchell, who says yes, we absolutely have it. But the surprise for me was that his argument wasn't just that we humans have free will. His argument is that all animals, right down to like single cell amoeba, also have free will, because when faced with an environment, right? Do basically, even at any given time, you can float randomly. You can move deliberately towards something
yeah.
because because it thinks there's food, or you can flee because there might be a predator, right? So you moving towards food, away from a predator, or just floating randomly. Well, that is a choice, and that is free will.
You have a number
Uh,
of options, and you
what
take them into
and now, what we didn't discuss, because I hadn't read your book yet, and what I didn't even think of,
Hmm.
is, well, if an amoeba has free will, right? That implies a choice
Hmm.
to have even a more constrained free will than we humans experience. But even if it is more constrained, that does imply a certain minimal level of intelligence.
Yeah.
And if I'm willing to grant an amoeba a certain level of intelligence, a lower level but still meaningful level of intelligence,
Then
given the ways in which plants interact with their environment and respond to it, I was far more open to your thesis than I might have been
right,
before actually hosting this
right,
podcast.
right.
Uh,
No, no, definitely. That's a great point. I mean, free will is the topic. I mean, for many people, right? And certainly, I mean, I understand you might have different inclinations a priori. Like some people might be inclined to say, hey, it might be a good illusion, right? The illusion of free will, right? It might pay off. It might pay off to think that we are free. Some other people might be more realist and say, no, it's not that it pays off to think that you are, but you truly are, right? And the truth is that I say this because regardless of your inclinations, to me, what's critical is that we treat any form of life as if on the same page. So if there is free will, there is for any form of life. If there is not free will, there is not free will for any form of life. But one way or another, we are all on the same page, right?
Right. So so either way, yeah, we're
All,
all we're
right.
all the same. Take
But
your you can choose each path, but there's
right,
nothing to distinguish
that's it.
plants from animals or humans from everything else.
But why? To me, the reason is that, again, so before, remember, I was talking about sensory integration. And we usually just speak of sensory integration as if it had to do with what's out there, like, esteroception, like the perception of the external world. But
Hmm.
on top of exteroception, we have interoception, we have proprioception, and plants do as well. So in plants, we know they integrate all incoming information, but both from the outside and from the inside. So they are organisms that can perceive exteroceptively, the external world, interoceptively, and proprioceptively. So this means that when we thought in these cartoon lab studies that, oh, they are not truly being provided the choice, they respond just like, automaton, like, okay, light, go for light, whatever. No, there is always a choice that we are simply missing because we are not looking at the truly rich repertoire, right? So if two plants exposed to the same conditions still might decide different course of action, that might has to do with the fact that they, from the inside out, are in a different internal stage. So their internal stages are part of what drives the will. And at some point, despite what's outside there being the same, one might say, I'm going to grow left, and on the other one might say, I'm going to grow right, because everything counts. And that means everything outside and everything inside. There is always a choice to be made. And if you take a different course of action at different points in time, that means that you are actually deciding to do one thing or another. Of course, when we speak of decision making in plants or in unicellulars, if you will, the problem is, again, as with the title of the book, when people say planta sapiens is a metaphor, they don't understand that if we remove ourselves from the picture and we avoid thinking that we provide the gold standard, decision making, being able to pick your choices, doesn't mean that there is a little Paco sitting at the wheel in my head. There is nobody doing the driving, and that's the delusion. We are
Right.
being deluded by the idea that there is a little homunculus sitting at the wheel doing the driving, who says Paco turn right or Paco turn left. And because they have this idea of human intelligence, they think, oh, who could be at the wheel in the case of the plant? And because they cannot picture somehow a little plant in the head of the plant, because we don't know what that could possibly mean, they are
Hmm.
decentralized, there is no head. Then they said, you see, plants cannot be making their decisions.
It's a ridiculous idea you have there, Paco. You've wasted your life's work.
That's it. That's it. So that's simply because we haven't got rid of ourselves as providing the gold standard. If we
Right.
were not here, we wouldn't see as weird that they are making their own decisions, despite nobody being sitting at the wheel, which is what happens in our own case.
Yes. Uh, I speak with with friends, and some episodes I'm very excited to talk about. And when I've mentioned this one uh, to a few of my folks, a few of my friends, um, pretty much always I've gotten the raised eyebrow,
Yeah,
like right, just
I
like
do that.
wow, you're really going, that's out there, like you're like most of your episodes are pretty grounded, Leslie, but plant intelligence, you're on, you're like, whoa, that,
A little bit too much.
yeah, are you are you sure you're not um becoming fringy, or giving a platform to the pseudoscientists?
Right.
So maybe I should have started with this, because I these are not These are generally open-minded people, and this is a fairly wide-ranging podcast, and they like most of the conversations. But when I mentioned this topic, they were like, "Oh, I mean, okay, I'll listen to it," but like it was very very skeptical, not quite antagonistic, but not far from it, reaction before reading your book, before hearing this
Right, right.
conversation. So maybe take a moment to explain to someone for whom the very premise of this conversation seems dubious,
Hmm.
and ground it in the scientific
Well,
method.
that's very well. That's very easy, but it's also very needed. So I'm very thankful for this question, because you see, that's every single day. These people raising the right brows. That's happening to me all day long. And what they don't get is that we don't need to be doing, again, going back to the methodology. We don't need
Mhm.
anything different from what we do when we study animal behavior. We need to have empirical hypotheses that can be tested. And this means having operational definitions, things that can be measured. We need to be able to make predictions. So, what is the difference between science and pseudoscience? It's the fact that you can or cannot make predictions. But we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that hypotheses, if they are orthodox or mainstream or uncontroversial, they are more scientific. No, hypotheses are scientific or not if they deliver predictions and can be tested or not, regardless of
Right.
whether they are
I,
orthodox or heterodox.
I mean, the history of science is
Right,
overturning
right.
previously held orthodoxy for a more
That's
subtle
it. So
and more accurate understanding of the
what's
universe.
important? What's important here? I insist. I'm not trying a priori to demonstrate plant intelligence. I'm using the scientific method to find out if they are intelligent or not. A different issue is how much evidence you have at the moment, and what is the theoretical reason for you to believe that they are intelligent, right? That they can be intelligent. So if you ask me, do you have robust enough evidence as of today? I'll always say no, because we always need more and more and more and more evidence. And the more evidence we have, the better. But that's how science proceeds. That's not a problem for this field in particular. So you need to have independent lab replications. You need to have good operational definitions. You need to make predictions. You need to gather the data. You need to avoid confirmation biases. You need to avoid subjective biases. You need to do science. but
Okay.
but I insist one more. So just one more thing. If imagine we go for a very heterodox, very crazy hypothesis, and yet scientific, right? So we can make the predictions and test it. Uh, Even if the hypothesis was falsified, was proved to be wrong, that is scientific progress, because we now have a better justification to stay with the less controversial one. But you cannot say, I'm going to stick to the uncontroversial one simply because the other one is too wild. You need to stick to this one because you don't have a good alternative explanation. And that means that you need to discard it. And that means that you need to test it. So either way, either if you're going to find false or negative evidence, you still need to test for alternative hypotheses. Otherwise, you don't know if the ones you have at the moment are good or not.
Right. And you said something there that's, I think, really important, that negative results are still good science, and
Absolutely.
I like that's crucial. I know that one of the major issues we have in healthcare and in drug development in particular is that if a drug doesn't work, the study doesn't get published, and we don't know. And then and so either someone else might think that, well, let's try this class of drugs for this thing. Well, that research has already been done, but because it wasn't published,
I wish I had
we
known.
don't know about that. Or people use a drug for something that is known to
Yeah,
someone
yeah.
that to be ineffective, but because it's not widely known, people are using ineffective treatments. So yes, I completely agree with you that negative results are a valuable contribution, and they need to be,
Reported.
given more, I guess, prestige, more importance than they are generally, not just on this topic.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but that does lead me to then my next question, which is, uh, so what is the current state of the plant intelligence hypothesis.
Okay.
We've collected a bunch of evidence. You said, there's not enough to declare definitively that in their own way plants are intelligent, but
Right.
you have written a book about it,
Yeah, yeah,
and you've defended the idea.
yeah. Hmm.
What, given everything that we know as of today, what can you tell us about the hypothesis
Hmm.
that plants are intelligent in a
Right.
meaningful sense of that term?
Okay. I'm gonna be very honest. Okay.
Yep,
And
please.
I know you are gonna appreciate it. You are gonna appreciate me being honest. Okay. Uh, right now, as of today, the problem we have is that the ratio of theoretical to empirical papers is, overblown. The theoretical wins. So we have far, 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 far more theory than empirical research. And the empirical research that we have as of today, the empirical research we have as of today, is either anecdotal or very fragmentary or sometimes even biased. So we have very, very, very patchy, heterogeneous amount of empirical evidence. You see how honest I'm being?
Mm-hmm.
Why I'm saying all this, despite having written a book on plant intelligence? Because I don't want to fool myself. And for the following reason, because you say, hey, Paco, okay, good, good, you are being honest, but then why the heck didn't you wait 10 more years to write your book, right? When you have that, right? That's your point, right? Uh, and here is the important issue, which is that we have forgotten how science works. Science is not inductive inference, it's not gathering data and data and data and data. And once I have a basket full of data, oh, the baby, the theory. No, it's the other way around. Science is hypothesis driven. So this means that you need to have good theoretical hypotheses in the first place, translate those into good empirical hypotheses in the second place, and then do experiments to gather data that you can interpret under a theory. So that's how science really.
For or against some point of view, Darwin's dictum, right?
That's it. But this is not, you mentioned before cherry picking. This is neither about cherry picking, not about non cherry picking. This is about hypothesis driven, which means not picking, being driven by a paradigm. So to me, the most important part is to put the paradigm in place. And that's what I've done in plant intelligence. In fact, even better, if I may, which is I provided more than one paradigm. Because one thing that is a disfavor to science, that's another thing that speaks to scientists' egos, is that they think we need to settle upon a paradigm and then start to do the work. And I never understood that. Why don't we settle for a variety of paradigms and try to make progress simultaneously in all of them? If you recall in the book, in two different chapters, I used two different paradigms. In one paradigm, I speak of information processing. And let's see what plants would look like if they are information processors. And in a different book, I speak of ecological psychology applied to plants, in which they are not in the business of processing information, but rather perceiving affordances, perceiving possibilities of interaction with the environment. So this means that having different paradigms is needed because they will drive you, they will lead you to making different empirical hypotheses. Now, again, I insist, if you ask me how much progress has been done on the experimental and empirical front on those hypotheses, I must say that very little progress. But the progress is being made in changing the way we see plants through different paradigms that then can be put to the test. And that's going to take a few decades. That's work in
So
progress. Work in
we
progress.
we've got the ideas, and now it's time to roll up our sleeves and do the work.
Absolutely, absolutely. But this step was needed. Otherwise, the whole plot is missed.
Okay, there is so much more in your book about the details. I have one more question, but if you want more, I recommend Planta Sapiens by Paco Calvo. I have one last question for you, and I want to move from the science and speak more
Hmm.
more broadly. Um, uh, back in March of 2023, I had a fascinating conversation about sentientism, which is the basic idea that anything with sentience has moral standing. So,
Right.
that's
I knew you would get in there.
yeah,
Point with
right.
it.
So, and the argument that many vegetarians and vegans make when they're making their dietary choices, there's a number of justifications for a vegetarian or a vegan diet, but one of them is that animals suffer, animals are intelligent, animals are sentient,
Mm,
and that we should not increase the suffering of sentient beings in the world.
mm.
So it's a moral stance. Um, if we grant the hypothesis, and again, so this is now I'm now getting ahead of the science. So I want to be clear that this is not scientifically grounded. This is a philosophical. I'm branching into philosophy and ethics here. But if we grant the hypothesis that plants are sentient, humans still need to eat, right? And so, what does it say that whether we eat plants or animals or a mixture of both, it is inherent for our own survival that something else that is both alive and meaningfully intelligent must become our food. And um, how would this change our view of the world and how we walk in it, and how we sustain ourselves in
Mm.
relation to the environment, uh, if it turns out that the evidence is in favor of a plant sentience? How do you think that's going to change
Yeah.
our ethics and morality, broadly speaking? I'd like your thoughts on that,
Yeah,
because I
yeah,
think that I think that has huge implications, and I've only just started thinking
yeah,
about
yeah.
them, and I'd really like to hear your insights.
No, fair enough. I mean, can we have compassion and at the same time not die from starvation, right?
Precisely, yes. Right, and if plants aren't intelligent, we can have compassion and not die of starvation by going vegetarian or going
Right,
vegan.
right, right, right. So,
But
so
now we're taking that option off the
yeah,
table,
yeah,
and I don't want to dismiss compassion. I mean, that's
yeah.
one of the core tenets of the Center for Inquiry
Well,
Canada:
I'm glad
reason, compassion, secular values.
it is because you don't need to get rid of it. I mean, this is a false dilemma. In the
Okay, then help me see through it, because I'm not seeing where it's false at this point.
Okay, it is actually. Because even in the way we usually phrase it, we speak as if the food at our table comes from the animal kingdom or from the plant kingdom, and we speak of kingdoms, right?
Right.
Uh, if you think about it, the category animal or the category plant, the kingdoms themselves are abstractions. So it's just a way of speaking. What exists is individuals. So particular dogs and cats, not the category cat or the category dog, right? So the category is a way of speaking. We have individuals doing things around, right? So why do I say this? Because by splitting this as if it was a matter of, hey, do I pick my food from this basket or from this other basket? We speak of the baskets themselves. And we don't pay attention to the suffering that an individual in those baskets might be exposed to unnecessarily. So you see, instead of saying, "Hey, should I eat meat or plants exclusively, just plants? Should I be a vegetarian or a vegan on ethical grounds?" To me, the question should be, "Hey, should I care that the food that is on my plate, regardless of the kingdom it's coming from, has been treated in a fair way and has not been, provided or treated in a bad manner unnecessarily?" And that affects to the individual, not to the category. See what I mean? So you might be stressing plants in intensive agriculture in unnecessary ways, and you might have organic production in a farm, non-intensive, and around in the open range or whatever you call that in English, right? So you might have welfare, and the discussion could be filtered in those terms rather than the category that you belong to.
Right. So it doesn't matter. So if I can paraphrase it, it doesn't matter so much what we eat. What matters is how we raise and treat
Absolutely.
the that which ultimately becomes our food.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can make good choices on ethical grounds, regardless of whether you are an omnivore or a vegan or a vegetarian. And you can make bad choices regardless of whether you are an omnivore, a vegan, or a vegetarian. You might be a vegetarian and a vegan and sleeping tight at night, and you shouldn't because you might have been eating just greens that were stressed unnecessarily.
Right. Well, okay. Well, that is again a very. I think that's a wonderfully provocative, in the sense of novel, way to end things. Paco Calvo, author of Planta Sapiens: The New Science of Plant Intelligence. Thank you so much for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry. Any last thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
Not really, not just to thank you because it was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I hope readers enjoy the book and happy to keep the interaction open.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks. Cheers.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please show your support at patreon.com/podcast4inquiry and give us a 5-star review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter or X at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.